You're listening to the Sustainable Hour, a weekly podcast. Today is number 331, and they keep getting better, we think. Our first guest today is Rebecca Huntley. Rebecca is just written a book that's getting a lot of coverage all over the place. I've listened to her on Zoominars 3 times. This is the 3rd time in the last week, so I think I've got a bit of an idea of what she's going to say, but something to look forward to here. The book that she's just written, that's just come out, is How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. And take it away, Rebecca.
Tony, I'm so pleased you want to keep talking to me. I thought you'd be sick of my voice by now.
No, never.
It's wonderful to be here, and I think one of the things I love about podcasts is that sense of intimacy and that sense of being really close to conversation. So even more than radio, I think there must be something about the fact that we often listen to it, our ears as we're doing other things around the family home or walking or anything else. So congratulations on 331 episodes. And look, it's interesting talking to you, Tony, because you've been in the movement for a very long time. You're a bit of a legend in the movement. And for me, as a kind of Johnny come lately in the environment movement, it's wonderful to have opportunities to talk to people who've been around for a long time. So where do you want me to start, Tony? What do you want me to do? I can start anywhere, but what's the best way to start?
Well, maybe a little bit about, let's get to know the real Rebecca, a little bit about your background, influences.
Yeah. So background influences. So I think I've always probably been political, but I haven't necessarily seen myself as an environmentalist. I had 2 parents who probably would never have stepped foot in the bush. My mother's Italian. She always said, "Wogs don't camp." And my father was an academic. So I didn't grow up in the Australian bush. I grew up in South Australia, and my family from northern Queensland. So I grew up near the sea, but not so much in the bush. But, and of course, my teenage years and my 20-something years were really focused on Labor Party progressive politics, but more the Labor Party, and feminism were the things that motivated me. I was never antagonistic to the environment movement. I remember really clearly the Franklin Dam. I would have been in high school, even early high school, when the Franklin Dam happened. And I kind of instinctively knew that the Franklin Dam was a bad idea, and I knew that the Labor Party were supporting efforts to protect that environment, that area. But, growing up, kind of being involved in politics when I was younger, the progressive part of the Labor movement and the environment movement in the Greens were at loggerheads on campuses to kind of control student politics. And so there was this kind of weird, the 2 parts of the progressive movement eating each other. Of course, that doesn't happen in adult politics at all. We never see the Greens and the Labor Party fighting over limited territory and forgetting that the real opponents of the Conservatives doesn't happen. But anyway, I think what that meant is that while I was, even in my 20s and 30s and even to my 40s, while I believed that climate change was real, I wanted urgent action, I never really defined myself as an environmentalist, and I never saw climate change as my fight. But I think lots of things changed over that time. I mean, one of the things that happened after 15 years of being somebody whose job was travelling around the country talking to different Australians about Australia, is I kind of had this kind of, developed this deep love for this country and the good as well as the bad. And I made a decision when I had my first child, who's now 12, that I really wanted her to grow up with a love of the Australian bush. Because I thought if she doesn't love the Australian environment, she's not going to protect it. So we did things like we went snorkeling in the Great Barrier Reef. I took her for a week to Kangaroo Island, which is before the fires. Spent a lot of time in Kangaroo Valley, and I wanted to take her to really learn to love the Australian bush so she would grow up to protect it. And we're doing that a bit with our twins that are 5, but nobody really wants to spend time in the Australian bush with twins that are 5. Like, I need to wait before they're really quite determined to kill themselves at, you know, every hour on the hour. And I think that, I mean, in that desire to instill that in her, it kind of instilled it in me. And then really, and I write about this, as you know, Tony, in the book, there was a moment for me, a really profound emotional, psychological, philosophical moment, really. I kind of find it hard to explain. It certainly wasn't intellectual and probably wasn't even political, where I realised, watching the students' climate strike, that I had not just a responsibility to get my kids to learn to love the Australian environment, to protect it, but that I had a responsibility to do something about climate change, because, you know, I needed to be part of a movement that was struggling to create a livable world for future generations. And so really that brought about, and that was about, you know, 18 months ago now, maybe 2 years ago, that led me to write the book. It led me now to, for all of my work is focused on trying to find a way to nail the climate change message with different audiences. And in that, so it's been a profound personal, emotional and professional reorientation of my life, which I'm finding really challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. And wonderful too to meet people like you, Tony, and other people on the call who've been involved for a lot longer. And one of the things they say to me, and I'll finish up in a minute by my long diatribe, but one of the things they say to me is that, you know, people who've been involved in the climate movement are really, really involved. It's really tiring. It can be incredibly discouraging. And so when they see new people come in with new ideas who want to listen, learn and contribute, then that kind of is a bit of an injection of new energy when different kinds of people who wouldn't have seen themselves as part of the movement come into it.
Rebecca, do you think there could be some sort of a recipe here with that energy that you bring to the table of, you mentioned falling in love, and this is something I've talked with many people about, falling in love with the earth. How do we change the debate from something that we are against to something that we are for?
It's a really good point. And one of the things that I was doing even before this happened is whenever we would recruit groups on environmental and climate issues, one of the things we'd ask people before we recruit them is, how much time do you spend in nature, and what do you do? And we'd really ask a question about a level of agreement with the idea that, you know, that human society and the natural environment are intertwined, and we shouldn't have to make a choice between protecting one and protecting the other. And that's actually really like a fundamental, that's what really divides people. If you think that, oh, there are people here and then there's a natural environment here, and we've always got to choose between human beings and trees, then you're always going to approach issues around environment and climate from a particular point of view. It doesn't mean you can't convince those people that we need renewable energy and that, you know, the fossil fuel industry is destructive. But it becomes a lot harder for people to make a connection between protecting the natural environment and their own personal interests. I do think that it can help to get people to spend time in the natural environment and understand not just in like one koala here and one tree here, but our interconnectedness. It doesn't always work. I mean, my Italian relatives live absolutely enmeshed in the bush, and they don't necessarily have very good news about climate change. So, and you know, and you can have people in the city who've never ever been, you know, never been to Kakadu, never been anywhere, and they'll always vote for climate change. It's not a kind of silver bullet, but it is really important, and it starts with education with kids at a very young age. I think the combination of them understanding of physical experiences in the natural environment, and interestingly, something that I didn't grow up with, which was an understanding of Indigenous history and what is to be protected. And that this is not just a kind of a natural landscape. This is a deeply important social, cultural, historical landscape that should be protected. My daughter's generation, and we understand that. And that, I think, is kind of really powerful as well.
Mm.
Rebecca, we're all aware that climate change and all of its mysteries, if you like, have been politicised in Australia and have been that way for something like 25, 30 years. So we in the Sustainability Hour tend to spend most of our time talking to fellow travellers,
Yes.
but occasionally we'll come up against somebody who is dyed-in-the-wool, closed mind on the subject.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that you, with a wider a wider sort of range, come across that too. Have you worked out a strategy that works with them?
It's a really good point. I think one of the things, so in the work that we're doing around segmenting the Australian population in terms of attitudinal mindsets around climate, there's probably about 4 different mindsets that I would say are, for various reasons, resistant to the climate change message. One of those groups, and it's a small group, but it's important because it tends to skew towards women with a lot of caring responsibilities, although not entirely, is kind of disengaged. They're disengaged from the climate message, but they're also disengaged from a lot of big political issues because their lives are overwhelmed. And they don't want to think about big systemic political issues because they find it really hard to even think about how they're going to solve them, let alone how they're going to get through the day with, you know, kids and not a lot of money. So for them, you know, then finding indirect ways to connect to them or connect with them around environment in a way that helps their lives rather than adds a whole lot of new stuff to do. Like, I've got to find new ways to recycle, I've got to buy an electric car. And this is why it can be quite powerful television shows that are fun, have multi-generational appeal, like the stuff that Craig Rucastle's done on the ABC. Can be really useful, you know, and it's really so engaging the disengaged can be tricky, but you can do it with different kinds of messages. Then there are people that you would describe as, I suppose they would say, as cautious on climate. So they believe it's happening. They're just really worried about how we're going to be able to manage a quick transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. They worry about jobs lost. They worry about the impact on the economy. They want that transition, but they're worried. And they're also just really underestimate the extent to which renewable energy is ready to hold that transition, to sustain it. So for them, it's about building confidence. Sometimes it's merely just about information, which is that the solar panel of today is not even the solar panel of 5 years ago. So then it can be about information and encouraging them to think that we can do it. So sometimes, and this is really hard for more progressive people, sometimes they're really like Aussie, 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 oi, 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 which is really patriotic and really kind of just really also, in some people would say parochial. It's not focused on international agreements or anything. It's like, this is good for Australia. This is going to give Aussies Aussie jobs, and that works extremely well with that group. Then there are people who we often describe as, doubtful. So for them, they're they're quite doubtful about the science, not dismissive, doubtful about the science, doubtful about the solutions. And again, a little bit like the cautious, it's about saying to them, look, believe what you want about climate change. This transition is happening. It's happening in places like China. It's happening globally. It's happening for big money and investors. If you don't want to believe in the science of climate change, don't believe in it. Believe in the science of solar cells and wind and everything that can do for us, and hydrogen. So you actually focus entirely on the solutions, and you may never talk to them about climate change. You may not engage with them on that. And then there are what we would describe as the dismissive, which is another term for deniers. It's important to note that in any survey done in any country, people who are hardcore deniers are always in the single digits in communities, right? So in Australia, it's about 9 or 10% of people would be hardcore deniers. In America, it's a little bit more. In the community, 10% who completely deny climate change can effectively be ignored. They can be ignored electorally, they're just not significant. They are significant if they're in significant positions of power in our parliaments, in our major political parties, and in our media. So I would say, if you are related to a denier or you have to sit next to them at Christmas dinner, just talk to them about Netflix. And we need to use all of our energy to make sure that the deniers who are in significant positions of power in our community, in our politics, who are stopping this absolutely necessary transition, need to be forced out. So forget Uncle Barry and make sure that we have 4 or 5 Zali Steggles across the country in the next election. So that's what I would talk. These are some strategies and also some mindsets when you're talking to these different groups of people who are not coming from where you're coming from.
And Rebecca, the book is available at all good bookshops?
It is, and it will soon be an audio book with my voice on it. So if my voice, which Tony, you seem to have no problem with my voice. You've heard it, or maybe you've heard it now too much. So it'll be an audio book very soon by Christmas, and it is also an ebook. So yeah, if you like what you hear, please do pick it up. I promise it's readable, and there's a few jokes in it as well.
Yeah, I think you've inherited your mother's sense of humour somehow, from what I can see so far. And yeah, it is lots of good advice for people on how to do it. And there's no one way, as comes out clearly in the book.
Yeah.
You appeal to some people's values. Yeah, there's a way that you can talk to, a direction you can come from for every single person, and just ignore the deniers.
Exactly.
It's worth it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.